again, please send those in as we go along. If you still want to take a crack at sending in what time of day it was when Peter told the crowd that the apostles were not drunk, go ahead and type that in, and we're going to draw at random at the end a winner to receive a signed copy of my book. So let's continue on now with looking at some of the ways that we need to show a lack of inhibition. Well, if you look at this picture here, you recognize the story of Jesus appearing on the balcony with Pontius Pilate, and also that's where Barabbas was brought on the scene. And to describe that a little bit, Pontius Pilate offered the crowds a choice between Jesus and Barabbas, and it really makes sense that the people called for Barabbas. You see, to Rome, Barabbas was a murderer. He was a bad guy. To the Jews, he was a freedom fighter, a hero, a real good guy. And as the people back then knew, the only thing that could stop a bad guy with a sword was a good guy with a sword. Sound familiar? We're no different today. When we encounter injustice, our gut reaction is a swift and powerful response, shock and awe. Well, we can learn a lesson from the story of Jackie Robinson, the first black professional baseball player. He grew up accustomed to fighting back against bigotry and prejudice that he faced. And when Branch Rickey, the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, offered him a contract, he warned him about the terrible taunts that he was about to face. He said it's going to be like nothing you have ever faced in your entire life. But he asked Jackie, will you be able to take it without fighting back? And Jackie said, oh, so you want a guy without the guts to fight back, huh? And Branch Rickey said, I'm looking for a guy who has the guts not to fight back. You see, those who live under the influence of Jesus are taught to fight injustice, but with a different set of weapons. Not revenge, but reconciliation. And sometimes that means taking a step back instead of striking back. So patiently enduring the wrongs that are directed at us, whether they're by coworkers, family members, friends, or strangers, that's not a recipe for the weak. It takes great strength to endure such wrongs, but also to trust that those wrongs that are now fully exposed will be dealt with by God, by God's justice, and in God's own time. Okay, on to our next attitude that changes under the influence of Christ. If you're anything like me, sad to say, driving can bring out the worst, doesn't it? For some reason, when we get behind the wheels of our cars, everyone else in the world becomes our competitor. I think it was George Carlin, the comedian, that said that everyone who's driving slower than you is an idiot, and everyone who's driving faster than you is a maniac. Someone must either get out of our way or face our wrath. Well, when you live under the influence of Jesus, a more gracious and civil attitude takes over. Other folks are seen no longer as rivals or competitors, but as fellow travelers on this journey. That's not to suggest that we turn a blind eye to less than charitable behavior that other peoples may show, but it does suggest that we not allow others' lack of charity to affect our disposition. And this type of kindness, unfortunately, has come to be seen as a form of passivity, much the way we interpret the word benign, the opposite of malignant. While a malignancy is something that actively destroys, we tend to think of something benign as being neutral, when in truth, the opposite of something malignant is something whose purpose is to actively do good. So the true meaning of the word benign is the characteristic of actively doing good. That's the biblical understanding of kindness, not just being neutral. Kindness is shown through concrete actions. Perhaps the greatest act of kindness, then, was the action of God sending us his only Son, Jesus, so that we might live under his influence. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the term slick salesman before, haven't you? When you encounter a slick salesperson who's being overly nice to you, you have to wonder at some point, whose interest does he really have in mind, yours or his? Well, in Scripture, Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan to illustrate that goodness is more than mere amiability. It's one of God's primary attributes, God's constant attention to humankind's best interests, even when humankind repeatedly failed. And the greatest example of God having our best interests in mind was the fact that he went out of his way to ensure that we have everything we need to succeed by sending us his only Son. So to live under the influence of Jesus, then, is to bring that goodness of God to others. Goodness, it's not something that's just measured by your ability to avoid doing badness. Rather, it's an active trait, an almost compulsive desire to pursue the best interests of other people, often at the cost of your own needs. A good example that I've been hearing a lot on the news recently is the practice of paying it forward, something that many people are doing at the drive-thru by paying for the person's order behind them. That's an act of goodness. So to live under the influence of Jesus is to stretch beyond our comfort zones in order to reveal God's goodness to others. And we do that by having their best interests in mind and by putting our own needs aside. Well, do you ever feel like simply throwing in the towel? I know a lot of us have felt that way this winter after shoveling snow for the umpteenth time and then being told, tonight's forecast, snow. Oh, you just feel like throwing in the towel and giving up. You know, life has a way of wearing us down to the point where sometimes we just don't feel like it's worth the effort. So we continue to go through the motions, but in reality, we've really just thrown in the towel. Well, living under the influence of Jesus is the antidote to this sentiment because of Jesus and his resurrection, we're compelled to never give up, to always have hope, because we know that God can overcome anything, even death. To live under the influence of Jesus is to stay on message, even and especially under duress, believing that what we're doing will bear fruit. Now, a great example of this was Blessed Mother Teresa. She was known to keep a poem on her wall that expressed this notion of staying on message. She didn't actually write this poem. In fact, many people wrongly attribute it to her, but it was kept up on her wall. And it reads like this: people are often unreasonable, illogical, and self-centered. Forgive them anyway. If you're kind, people may accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Be kind anyway. If you're successful, you'll win some false friends and some true enemies. Succeed anyway. If you're honest and frank, people may cheat you. Well, be honest and frank anyway. What you spend years building, someone could destroy overnight. Build anyway. If you find serenity and happiness, they may be jealous. Be happy anyway. The good you do today, people will often forget tomorrow. Do good anyway. Give the world the best you have, and it may never be enough. Give the world the best you've got anyway. You see, in the final analysis, it's between you and your God. It was never between you and them anyway. On a personal level, I think the best example of that I ever encountered of this type of unshakable faithfulness was a priest by the name of Father Larry Craig. He did prison ministry for many years in Chicago before his untimely death in 2006. And once when I was chatting with him, he mentioned that in his 15 years of prison ministry, working with about 5,000 inmates, that he had probably turned around about 6 lives. And I was floored by that. I asked him, Father Larry, how are you able to keep motivated with such a low success rate, for lack of a better word. And he replied, I do it because it's the right thing to do. Jesus said, when I was in prison, you visited me. Period. End of sentence. That's what I call staying on message in the real world, living under the influence of Jesus. Well, perhaps the most difficult part of living under the influence of Jesus is learning to live by the notion of turning the other cheek. Doesn't that sound like fun? To most of us, it sounds like an invitation to become a doormat and to invite other people to walk all over us. Well, Scripture describes the quality of turning the other cheek as meekness, meekness, meekness. That's not to be confused with weakness. It's more a matter of remaining even-keeled. In fact, there's a popular phrase that I've seen on Facebook that says, if you think meek is weak, try being meek for a week. I love that. In Scripture, meekness is not weakness, and it has no affinity for cowards. Rather, it's a quiet strength that's acquired through self-discipline. To live under the influence of Jesus is to be strong enough to stand up to what the world throws at us. In fact, showing a greater strength, but one that's held in check. To live under the influence of Jesus allows us to strive for something greater instead of settling for a petty response. It means to be able to see and to think clearly, and as a result, be able to reach for higher things. So under the influence of Jesus, we're able to absorb the blows that life and those in our lives send our way, knowing that we have a greater weapon and a greater goal in life. And finally, the ninth attitude that we're taking a look at that changes under the influence of Jesus. Each day we unthinkingly conform to realities all around us. And some of those are good and some are not so good. And an extreme and very tragic example of conforming to something negative in society was, of course, the atrocities performed by Nazi Germany during World War II. And at the Nuremberg trials that followed the war, and this is a picture you're looking at there, one Nazi officer after another simply claimed that they were just doing their job. They were just conforming to the culture around them. It wasn't their fault. Just doing what they were supposed to do, following orders without questioning. Well, to live under the influence of Jesus is to be mindful of decisions we make, and in some cases to choose to be maladjusted, a word that Dr. Martin Luther King used, to be maladjusted to those aspects of our culture that are not in line with the gospel. So this notion of being maladjusted to society comes from Dr. King, who back in the mid-1950s called on all people to be maladjusted to a way of life that included lynch mobs, segregation, discrimination, inequalities, excessive militarism, and physical violence. And he called people to be maladjusted, as did the prophet Amos, who in the face of injustice forcefully called for justice to roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. So Dr. King was reminding us that the world encourages habits that we all too often adopt uncritically. Instead of considering them in light of the gospel, we simply adjust or conform to them. He and Jesus call us to be maladjusted to the evils of the world. That's at the heart of living under the influence of Jesus.